Imagine for a moment you stand at the edge of all you've known. The noise of the world dims, not because it's gone silent, but because something within you grows louder, clearer. You've come here not to chase more ideas or collect hopeful words. You've come to meet the power that has always been within you, waiting. The threshold of true change doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like deep breath, stillness, and the steady opening of an inner door. As Emmet Fox once taught, there is no problem that enough focused thought on God cannot dissolve, not metaphorically, literally. But to wield that kind of power, you must first understand what it means to truly turn your mind away from the appearance of a problem and toward the reality of God. So before we journey inward, I invite you to like and subscribe, but only if it truly resonates with your soul. Now breathe into this. You are not your confusion. You are not your fatigue. You are not even your story. Beneath all of that is you, a thinking being, yes, but more than that, a chooser of thought. And right now, that power is rising in you like a quiet fire. No matter how complex your situation may seem, no matter how tangled your feelings or thick the fog of uncertainty, there is a place in you that has never been afraid. It's not distant. It's not hidden in some spiritual mountain. It's here, now, waiting for your permission to lead. That place is not your emotion. It's not your ego trying to fix things. It's awareness itself, clear, unwavering, silent. And yet, the human mind, untamed, distracted, afraid, loves noise. It feeds on tension. It loops through the same stories again and again, under the illusion of solving them. It tells itself it's being responsible, thoughtful, prepared. But in truth, it's often just dancing with fear. You've felt that, haven't you? That cycle of thinking harder, trying more, obsessing deeper, and feeling worse. That's not wisdom. That's addiction to control. And control is not power, it's panic, dressed up in logic. But something different happens when you step back from that pattern, not just emotionally, but spiritually. You start to taste something stronger than effort, clarity. Not the kind of clarity that fixes everything in a snap. No, this is the deeper kind. The kind that reminds you, I don't have to fix everything. I only have to see differently. From that seeing, action becomes clean, response becomes elegant. And most of all, you stop leaking energy into problems that only feed on attention. So let's say this clearly, right now. You do not fight darkness. You turn on the light. That is the root of the golden key. You do not mentally wrestle with what's wrong. You do not fixate on how to fix it. You do not argue with fear. You turn your full attention, calm, unwavering, to the truth, to the light, to God, not as a being floating in the clouds, but as principle, power, presence. That attention is not passive. It is the greatest force you possess. And in that moment of real turning, the old mental circuits, the loops of fear, resentment, guilt, striving, begin to short-circuit. They lose their fuel. This is not magic. It is metaphysical law. Every time you give full focus to the truth of God, life, intelligence, order, you unhook from the emotional storm and re-anchor yourself in cause. You are no longer reacting to effects. You are standing in cause. You are standing in reality, not appearance. And in that standing, a transformation begins, not outside you, but in the atmosphere of your consciousness. And yes, your world must follow. It has no choice, but you must choose, again and again. This is the difference between people who dabble in spiritual ideas and those who become living expressions of them. It's not about believing harder, it's about choosing differently, moment to moment, thought to thought. Right now, there is no mountain to climb, no spiritual badge to earn. Only one thing is needed, the decision to place your attention where it belongs, not on the noise, not on the fear, but on the source that is never in panic, on the truth that has no opposite, on the God within you, which neither shouts nor forces, but waits, calm, steady, eternal. So what is the golden key? It is not a ritual. It is not a prayer you repeat to feel better. It is a law of consciousness, as certain as gravity, as personal as your next thought. It asks you to do one thing: turn from your problem. Think of God, not once, not quickly, not out of desperation, but with the poise of someone who knows this is not avoidance, this is alignment. And from that alignment, the world must change, because you've changed, because you've remembered, because you've come back to where your real power lives. Thought is the doorway, always has been. Every experience you've ever had, good, bad, profound, or mundane, walked into your life through the silent gate of thought. Not necessarily a conscious thought. Often it was a belief long held, a conclusion drawn in pain, or a story you never realized you were telling. But the gate remained the same, and now you stand before it again, not as a victim of circumstance, but as its architect. The nature of thought is not just mental, it is formative. It shapes the atmosphere of your being. It selects what you perceive, it amplifies what you focus on, and it draws into form that which matches its tone. This is not theory, it's law. And you've seen it in action more times than you may realize. Think of moments when fear gripped you, how your body reacted, how your breath shortened, how everything around you seemed to bend to that fear. Did the outer world change in that instant? But your perception did, and perception is the lens through which reality takes shape. On the other hand, think of moments you were calm, grateful, or quietly aligned. Even the difficult circumstances felt different, less sharp, less consuming. That, too, was the result of thought, focused thought. Emmet Fox didn't speak of thought as a surface-level activity. He spoke of it as the cause of causes, and if you understand that even partially, you begin to reclaim something most people never do: authority over your own state of being. Let's go further. Most people live reactively. Their thinking is like a mirror, reflecting whatever passes in front of it. The problem with this is that mirrors don't choose what they reflect. They simply echo. But you are not a mirror. You are a projector. You are the one who determines what light shines through, and therefore what shape the outer world takes in response. The danger, of course, is in forgetting this, in believing that thinking is just something that happens to you rather than something you do. And when that happens, when attention runs wild and unguarded, you become a magnet for confusion, anxiety, repetition. Not because you're broken, but because attention, like soil, will grow whatever seed you drop into it. Whether you plant truth or fear, the law doesn't care. It only says, as you sow, so shall you reap. So now the question becomes, what are you truly thinking about? Not just when you're meditating, not just when you're listening to spiritual teachings, but in those quiet, unsupervised moments, the ones that fill most of your day. Are you turning the wheels of a problem or holding the frequency of peace? Are you clenching around control or relaxing into presence? You may think these little shifts in thought don't matter, but they do. They are everything. And here is where the golden key begins to show its brilliance. It doesn't demand that you force new outcomes or control outside events. It only asks this: shift your attention, change the subject inwardly, withdraw your energy from the pattern of the problem, and place it wholly on the idea of God, on light, on life, on the quiet certainty that something greater than your personality is at work, and always has been. This shift, while simple, is not always easy, because the mind has habits. It likes to return to its familiar corners, rehearsing fear, dramatizing struggle, looping old concerns under the guise of responsibility. But spiritual responsibility is not about worry. It's about direction. It's about using the power of your thought with precision and devotion, not as a reaction to life, but as an offering to life. So when you catch yourself entertaining fear, even subtly, do not judge yourself. But also, do not stay there. That's the mastery. Not in perfection, but in repetition, turning, redirecting, over and over again until that turning becomes your new center of gravity. You begin to live with awareness. You notice when your mind starts to spiral, and instead of indulging it, you pause, you choose. You say silently, no. I will not feed this. I turn now to God. That single act, done sincerely, consistently, is how mountains move. Because the problem is not the mountain. The problem is the mind that keeps staring at it, forgetting the source that created the mountain and the power that resides in you to walk through anything. This is the role of thought. This is why Emmet Fox called it a key. Because with thought rightly focused, doors open. Not because you forced them, but because the alignment of consciousness makes the way clear. Never underestimate the creative force of your attention. It is not weak, it is not vague, it is not poetic, it is direct, alive, magnetic. And when it rests on the divine, on whatever name you give the highest reality, it begins to vibrate at that frequency. From that frequency, all things adjust. Internally first, then externally, as a mirror. So this is your task again and again, not to fight thought, but to guide it, not to suppress fear, but to outgrow it by feeding the greater idea. This is not mental gymnastics, this is spiritual architecture. Each thought, especially the persistent ones, lays a brick in the invisible structure of your life. And now that you understand this, you no longer have to live by default. You choose, you focus, you build, thought by thought. Word count 1090. Awaiting continue. Section 3. You must understand this clearly. The problem is not just the situation. It's not the unpaid bill, the illness, the betrayal, the silence from someone you love. Those are expressions, not the root. The real problem is what the mind does with those expressions, how it grips them, interprets them, replays them, how it feeds them, dresses them up with emotion, and then kneels before them as if they hold ultimate truth. This is the invisible trap of the problem. It seduces your attention until the problem becomes your God. Yes, your God. Because whatever dominates your attention receives your worship. And worship is not a ceremony. It's not incense or prayer hands. It's focus. It's where you give your energy, your belief, your inner gaze. When you keep thinking about a problem, day after day, conversation after conversation, you are feeding it. You are bowing to it. And though you may not mean to, you are saying, "This is what holds power over me." That's the real crisis, not the event, but the loyalty of thought you keep giving it. And the mind is clever. It tells you that you're just being realistic, just trying to plan, solve, handle. But underneath that facade is fear, a fear that says, if I don't obsess about this, something worse will happen. That belief is poison. It's ancient, subtle, and socially accepted, but it is not truth. In fact, it's the very mechanism by which people stay stuck in patterns for years, sometimes lifetimes. You were not made to serve problems. You were made to serve truth. So, let's look deeper. What happens when you let a problem fill your mental space? First, it multiplies. You begin thinking of all the secondary problems that might come from the first one. Then, you imagine how others will react. Then you start forming defense strategies, emotional armor, exit routes. All of this happens inside your consciousness, and that environment becomes the atmosphere you walk in. Tense, narrow, heavy. No matter how strong your words or how well you hide it on the outside, your energy tells the truth. People feel it, situations reflect it, and that, more than anything, determines what comes next. But here is the great irony. Most people believe that by focusing on their problem, they are gaining control, when in reality, they are surrendering control, handing it over to fear disguised as logic. To stop this cycle, you must call it what it is, mental idolatry. Not in the religious sense, but in the spiritual physics of it. Anything you place above the truth of divine power in your awareness becomes a false god. And false gods always demand more than they give. This is why Emmet Fox was adamant about turning from the problem entirely, not negotiating with it, not bargaining with it, but turning. That act of turning is not weakness. It is the fiercest form of clarity. It says, I recognize this appearance, but I do not give it power. I see through it, not with naivety, but with spiritual intelligence. You may ask, but don't I need to deal with the issue? The answer is yes, but not from a place of internal submission. You deal with it after you've shifted your state, after you've turned your mind toward principle, because only then can you see clearly. Only then does your action carry the weight of wisdom instead of the weight of fear. Remember this, the longer you stare at a problem, the more it grows, not in size, but in seeming. It starts to feel inevitable, permanent. That's an illusion. It's not the situation that's becoming stronger, it's your agreement with it. And that agreement is always optional. This is where spiritual maturity begins, not in quoting teachings, but in catching yourself mid-obsession and choosing differently. Saying, I see what I'm doing, and I stop now. I turn now. Not because the problem deserves it, but because you do. Because your peace is more important than your analysis. Because your power is more important than your commentary. You may not be able to change the outer condition immediately, but you can change where you place your attention. That shift, made repeatedly, sincerely, creates space. And in that space, grace enters, ideas come, strength returns, solutions begin to rise, not as mental inventions, but as clear inner knowing. This is not passivity, it is precision. And yet the mind will resist. It will say, but if I stop thinking about the problem, won't I lose control? Won't things get worse? That is the voice of the ego, terrified of becoming irrelevant. It thrives in tension, it thinks without direction, and it panics when you begin to center yourself in truth. But that panic is not a signal to stop. It's a signal that the old mental habit is dying. Let it die. Do not give your energy to fear just because it's familiar. Do not mistake overthinking for strength. True strength is quiet, grounded, attentive to truth. So take this in deeply. Turning from the problem is not denial. It is divine defiance. It is the refusal to let fear sit on the throne of your consciousness any longer. You are not your crisis. You are not the noise of your mind. You are the one who chooses what to dwell on. And that choice, right now, is your liberation. There is a secret most people miss, not because it's hidden, but because it's too simple for the restless mind to value. It is this: you cannot think two thoughts at the same time, and whatever thought you hold dominant, the other must recede. This is the core of what Emmet Fox called the golden key. It is not about struggling with problems or erasing them. It is about substituting your focus, replacing fear with truth, replacing tension with clarity. Not by force, but by attention. The principle of substitution is not theoretical. It is mechanical. Like light replacing darkness, like warmth pushing out cold, the higher thought does not argue with the lower. It simply displaces it. This is what makes the golden key so powerful. It doesn't require spiritual prowess, years of study, or emotional perfection. It only asks for one thing: the deliberate redirection of your thought toward God. Now that may sound abstract, but what it means is simple. When the mind wants to dwell on what's wrong, you instead dwell on what is eternally right. When the heart trembles with uncertainty, you place your focus, not on the waves, but on the steady ground beneath them. That steady ground is God, principle, life, love, the intelligence that governs all, including this very moment. You substitute your thought, not by pushing the problem away, but by lifting your gaze. Imagine standing in a dark room with a single candle. You don't fight the darkness, you light the flame. The room doesn't resist, it just shifts. That is how consciousness works. When you lift your thought to God, the lower vibration of fear has no place to anchor. It cannot survive in that atmosphere. This is not emotional bypass. This is spiritual hygiene. But let's be clear, substitution requires discipline. The mind will not automatically choose the higher thought. It will return to the familiar. It will tug at your sleeve, whispering what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. It will masquerade as caution or practicality. Don't fall for it. This is not about ignoring real circumstances. It is about refusing to give them the center of your mind. Let's say you're facing a financial challenge. The normal mental reflex is to rehearse scarcity, tighten, worry, scramble. But when you substitute that line of thought with one centered on divine abundance, you're not pretending the challenge doesn't exist. You're saying, this appearance does not define reality. Reality is abundance. Reality is circulation. Reality is supply flowing through divine law, not through panic. You repeat that truth. You meditate on it. You speak it into your own heart, not to escape, but to anchor. Because the moment your mind stops obsessing over lack and starts communing with the idea of supply, your vibration changes, your posture changes, your capacity to receive changes. Why? Because you're no longer blocking the flow with resistance. The same is true for health, relationships, direction, anything. The moment you stop cycling through the noise of the issue and start filling your mind with the nature of God, a shift occurs, first within, then around. Now here's the key distinction. This is not about positive thinking. Positive thinking tries to feel better by sprinkling sugar over pain. It's cosmetic. Substitution is different. It is root-level transformation. You are not decorating the problem. You are removing its platform by withdrawing your focus. This takes courage. Because part of you wants to keep returning to the old thought, just to check in, to see if the problem has gone away yet. But every time you do that, you water the weed. You re-enter the old agreement. You hand back authority. So, you must choose, again and again, not forcefully, but faithfully. The thought of God, not as a distant figure, but as the actual ground of your being, must be the place your mind rests. Not visits occasionally, but abides. This is how substitution becomes transformation, because over time, what you consistently substitute becomes your new default. And that's when things begin to move, quietly, often imperceptibly at first, but steadily. Opportunities open, people shift. Your ideas become clearer. Not because you manipulated the outer world, but because you reorganized your inner allegiance. You broke the habit of fear by replacing it, not analyzing it, not wrestling with it, not burying it, but replacing it. This is spiritual maturity. This is the architecture of change. This is the golden key in action. It is not a ritual. It is not even a method. It is a law. And the more you live by it, the more the problem loses its grip, not because you fought harder, but because you no longer made it your center. You made truth your center. You made God your dwelling place, and everything else adjusted accordingly. Turning means turning, not thinking about turning, not philosophizing about the value of spiritual focus, not rehearsing affirmations while still peeking at the problem. It means turning, fully, cleanly, deliberately. This is where many seekers falter. They nod at the truth but never shift the gaze. They glance at God while keeping one eye on fear, and then they wonder why nothing changes. But turning is not a mental lean, it's a pivot of consciousness, a redirection so complete that the old thought loses its fuel because the mind is no longer feeding it. You cannot look in two directions at once. You may try to flicker between them, between concern and trust, between I know the truth and but what if it all goes wrong? But the spiritual law is unwavering. What you focus on, you energize. And what you energize, you extend into experience. So turning is the act of reclaiming your focus, not for a second, not for a minute, but for as long as it takes for your inner state to become anchored in the new direction. Imagine you're sailing. The winds are fierce. The waves are unpredictable. And you, at the helm, keep tugging the wheel one way, then back the other, uncertain. You never fully commit to a heading. You want calm seas, but you won't pick a course. That's how many people live internally, pulled by spiritual wisdom, but still negotiating with fear. But when you truly turn, the shift is unmistakable. Not because the storm outside stops instantly, but because your direction becomes unwavering. You move in alignment with principle. You stop reacting and start commanding, not in force but in inner conviction. This is the essence of the golden key, turning your attention away from the problem and placing it on God. Not to make the problem go away, but because you recognize that your peace, your power, your clarity cannot exist where your gaze is fractured. And yes, the mind will test you. It will try to pull you back. It will ask, "But what if this doesn't work?" It will whisper doubts, sometimes louder than your prayers. But that's not a sign that you've failed. It's a sign that you're changing, because the old pattern is losing its grip. So, you return to the turning. You return to truth. You bring your focus back, not with force but with faith. Over and over again until turning is no longer an event. It's a way of being. Now there is something here you must know. True turning is not about escaping pain. It's about transcending allegiance to the lie. Because every problem, no matter how convincing, is built on some untruth. A belief in separation, in lack, in limitation. Turning is how you reject the lie, not intellectually but energetically. You're not ignoring the issue. You're refusing to give it the seat of power. And this refusal is not passive, it is bold. It says, "I no longer accept this as my authority. I will not bow to appearances. I turn to the source, I turn to life. I turn to God, not as fantasy, but as the foundation of my being." You turn, not because you're in denial, but because you've chosen where your allegiance lives. And once that choice becomes consistent, you find something extraordinary begins to emerge. Peace that isn't based on outcome. This peace isn't the quiet that comes after the resolution. It's the stillness that appears before anything has changed. And that's when you know the turning is real. When your nervous system settles, not because the facts got better, but because your gaze remembered what's true. From this place, solutions come, not from strain, but from clarity. You act, yes, but not from the pressure to escape a problem. You act from the center of truth. That action is clean, it lands, it carries power. So understand this. The golden key doesn't promise you won't have to make a phone call, have the conversation, move the money, end the cycle. It promises that you'll do those things from a completely different consciousness. And because of that, the results will mirror your clarity, not your chaos. And what if, for a while, the outer world doesn't change right away? Then you stay turned, not because it's working, but because it's the truth. You don't turn for results. You turn because the truth is the only place worth living from. Because alignment is its own reward. Because God is not your tool, God is your ground. And when that becomes clear, you'll no longer measure the success of your spiritual practice by how quickly problems disappear. You'll measure it by how completely you remain centered, regardless of what appears. That is spiritual freedom. That is the fruit of the turn. That is how the invisible becomes real, not by force, but by fidelity. There's a vast difference between thinking about God and thinking God. One is abstraction. The other is presence. One keeps you circling the idea. The other draws you into living truth. When Emmet Fox spoke of turning your attention to God, he wasn't calling for religious sentiment or conceptual pondering. He was pointing to a direct mental and spiritual act, the steady, disciplined placing of your focus on God as reality, not as theory. This is where many well-meaning seekers slip. They fill their minds with talk of God, quoting texts, reciting names, speaking of attributes, but all the while, their actual attention is still anchored in the problem, still entangled in fear, still measuring, anticipating, defending. That is not turning, that is circling. To turn is to make God, not the idea of God, but the felt reality of God, the very center of your inner gaze. That gaze might not have words, it might not need them, but it has intention. It says, "This is where I abide now," not in the fear, not in the logic, but in the presence that is beyond either. This presence is not floating in the clouds. It is in your breath, your heartbeat, your very capacity to choose thought. It is not a being among beings. It is being itself. And when you think from that rather than about it, everything changes. So what does this look like in practice? Say your mind starts to spiral around a concern, your health, your job, your relationship. The thoughts come, uninvited, loud. Old reflexes kick in, analyzing, dreading, looping. But now you catch it. And instead of wrestling with the thought or trying to fix it mentally, you shift. You pivot. You turn to God, not to explain, not to plead, but to focus. You might say inwardly, God is life, and I live in that life now. Or, divine intelligence governs all that concerns me. Or perhaps no words at all, just a clear, quiet focus on the essence of what is whole, steady, unshaken. And in that act, something begins to open. Not because you solved the problem, but because you stopped kneeling before it. You stepped out of its gravitational pull. You made God, not fear, the axis of your inner world. And here is the nuance. This kind of focus is not intense or strained. It is still and sure. It is not a frantic grabbing at the divine. It is a returning to what was never absent. The moment you truly focus on God, even for a few seconds, you are no longer in reaction. You are no longer asking, how will I get through this? You are resting in that which has already overcome. You begin to recognize that peace isn't something you gain once the dust settles. Peace is what you bring into the dust. And that peace is the fingerprint of presence. This is why Emmet Fox emphasized not just prayer, but correct prayer. Not filled with fear or begging or insistence, but rooted in the clear knowledge that God is the only reality worth entertaining. The rest is just appearance, momentary and malleable. The practice, then, is this. Every time you feel pulled toward fear, refocus, not once, not to test it out, but as a way of life. You'll begin to see that the longer you stay in focus, the more your nervous system relaxes, not because the problem is gone, but because you're no longer carrying it with your thinking. You've set it down, not in denial, but in trust. And that trust is not passive. It's potent. Trust is alignment. Trust is the soil in which new possibilities grow. And when your focus stays planted in God, the outer world must respond, not because you demanded it, but because your inner frequency changed, and life echoes that. This is not philosophy. This is cause and effect. You may notice that after focused attention on God, the problem seems lighter, smaller. Sometimes it even resolves without your direct intervention. That's not coincidence. That's law. You stepped out of resistance and into resonance, and life, true to form, reshaped around that vibration. But even if nothing seems to shift on the outside, you have shifted, and that's everything. That's the whole point. Because from that place, even the hard tasks, conversations, decisions, boundaries become infused with clarity and authority. You are no longer pleading for help. You are moving with help. You are no longer reciting spiritual language while operating from fear. You are no longer thinking about God. You are thinking God. And from there, all things follow. Purity of attention is not a spiritual luxury. It is the lifeblood of transformation. It is what determines whether your practice is alive or just symbolic, whether you're turning in truth or simply talking about it while secretly clinging to fear. Most people don't lose their peace in one dramatic moment. They lose it bit by bit, each time they glance back at the problem. Not always overtly. Sometimes just a flicker of doubt, a moment of inner replay, a mental rehearsal of worst-case outcomes. Each return, however brief, breaks the circuit of alignment. Not catastrophically, but incrementally. And if repeated, it pulls the soul back into the gravity of the very thing it meant to rise above. That is why spiritual teachers from Fox to Troward to Holmes emphasize the guarding of your mind, not obsessively, not with tension, but with respect for its creative power. Your thought is not casual. Your attention is not neutral. Where it rests, things grow. And here's the honest truth. Most people allow their thoughts to wander wherever emotion pulls them. They mistake processing for wisdom, when often it's just rehearsed suffering. They mistake caution for realism, when it's really just a softened name for fear. You don't have to shame yourself for this. It's common, it's human. But now you know better. And once you know the power of attention, you are responsible for where it goes. So how do you keep your attention pure? First, by becoming intimate with your own mental patterns. You must watch your thought the way a craftsman watches the edge of his tool. Not in paranoia but in precision. You catch the drift toward worry early. You feel the temptation to replay the problem, and instead of indulging it, you pivot. You might pause and say, "Number, I know where that thought leads. I do not feed it. I return to truth." Again and again. You protect the atmosphere of your inner world the way a gardener protects fertile soil. No weeds allowed, not because weeds are evil, but because they are invasive. They choke life. And life is what you're here to grow. Emmet Fox was clear. When you turn to God, you do not look back, not even for a moment. You do not analyze the problem while simultaneously trying to hold divine focus. That's like trying to steer a ship by looking at the storm behind you. You cannot move forward while fixated on what you fear. The mind might protest. It will say, "But I need to understand what's happening." No, you don't. Not yet. You need to align first. Understanding without alignment is just mental noise. But alignment, even without full understanding, brings peace, which becomes clarity, which births right action. This is how you begin to live in spiritual order. Now, this doesn't mean you never think about challenges, but it means you only approach them from a centered state, not from desperation, not from fear, but from the poise of one who knows, "I am grounded in something greater than the appearance." From that state, even hard decisions become cleaner. Not always easier, but clearer, because the energy behind them is no longer entangled with panic. So yes, purity of attention is a discipline, but it is also a liberation. Because once you get used to abiding in God Consciousness 7 for minutes at a time, you begin to crave it, not out of escape, but out of resonance. You recognize the stillness, the clarity, the spaciousness that arises when your thought is no longer torn, and that recognition becomes your compass. Over time, it gets easier. The gap between wandering and returning gets shorter. The addiction to worry loses its grip. Not because you try harder, but because you fall in love with the stillness that comes from truth-centered thought. That stillness is not emptiness. It is fullness, without tension. It is presence, without noise. And from that place, you stop chasing answers. You start receiving them, not always in words, sometimes as a knowing, sometimes as an unexpected phone call, or a sudden idea, or a shift in your own behavior that changes the situation entirely. But even if no external solution comes right away, you no longer flinch, because your gaze is steady. And a steady gaze, held long enough, always becomes reality. You're not using your thought to make something happen. You're using it to reflect what's already true. That God is, that truth is whole, that love governs, that your life is unfolding according to a greater pattern that your fear cannot see, but your spirit already knows. So, protect your attention, not out of fear but out of reverence. Because what you attend to, you invite. And what you invite, you become. There comes a subtle but vital moment in your spiritual practice where you must ask yourself, am I turning to God to find truth or to escape discomfort? That question cuts deep, because the truth is, many people turn to the idea of God not as center, but as solution. They don't seek alignment, they seek relief. They don't seek presence, they seek escape. And as long as God remains your escape route, your connection will remain shallow, conditional, and inconsistent. You don't need punishment for this. You need clarity. And clarity begins with honesty. When you approach God only when the pain peaks, your thought is still organized around the problem. God becomes a tula, means to an end. I'll focus. I'll pray. I'll speak the words, as long as it gets me out of this. But that kind of bargaining doesn't anchor you. It actually tightens the very loop you're trying to break. Because beneath it, you're still saying, the problem is real, the fear is justified, and God must fix it fast before it hurts more. That is not faith. That is anxiety dressed in sacred language. Here's the shift. God is not the answer to your problem. God is the reality in which the problem dissolves. You're not using presence to manipulate appearances. You're using presence to relocate your identity out of fear into truth. And from that relocation, new appearances arise naturally. So, when you turn to God, let it be for the sake of truth, not comfort. Let your focus be rooted in reverence, not panic. Let your thought declare not as performance, but as knowing, God is here, God is order, God is life. I abide in that. And yes, in the beginning, you'll feel the pull to check back in on the problem. You'll wonder if your spiritual effort is working, but that wondering is itself the problem. It reveals a mind still tethered to outcome, still measuring peace by the timeline of results. Let's say this plainly. God is not your emergency plan. God is your source. And you don't align with source to get out of trouble. You align because it's the only place where anything real can begin. This shift in posture changes everything. You stop begging. You stop pleading. You stop demanding. You begin to stand. Not arrogantly, but with inner authority. You walk through the situation with your spine straight, your eyes clear, because your allegiance is no longer to the wavesits, to the ocean beneath them. And from that place, peace comes, not always instantly, but authentically, because your center is no longer contingent on whether the problem vanishes. Your center is rooted in the unshakable, and problems, no matter how loud, cannot outlast what is eternal. Now here's something powerful. When you abide in this truth, not for the purpose of fixing something, but because it is true, you begin to feel larger than your circumstance. Not as ego, but as essence. You feel vast, quietly and vulnerable. And from that space, even the situation that once seemed crushing begins to shrink in significance. You gain altitude. You stop living under the problem and start seeing above it. And from that vantage point, new ideas come. Doors you hadn't seen open. Or sometimes, nothing external changes, but your inner composition has. And that, in itself, is the miracle. You are not here to use God like a vending machine. You are here to become a living expression of God's order, intelligence, and wholeness. That doesn't mean you won't act. It doesn't mean you won't speak up, move forward, make decisions. But you'll do it from a centered state, not a reactive one. And that centered state is only available when God is your focus, not your exit plan. So ask yourself gently, do I seek presence because it is true, or because I hope it will spare me discomfort? And then turn again, not to judge yourself, but to realign. Turn not for outcome. Turn for truth. Because that truth is not a means to your end. It is the end. It is the place where striving ceases and knowing begins. It is the place where you stop searching and start standing. And when you stand there deeply, consistently, your entire life reorganizes itself not to rescue you, but to reflect the vibration of your new allegiance. So stop asking for escape. Start embodying order. God is not out there, fixing things on your behalf. God is in here, shaping you into the very solution your old self was begging for. This is not poetry. This is power. There is a moment on the inner path when you feel something quiet, irreversible begin to unfold. It's not a bolt of light or a sweeping sense of victory. It's more like a pause. A subtle pause in the fight you've been carrying for so long. You feel it not in your thoughts, but in your nervous system. The muscles in your chest begin to release. The breath deepens, not by force, but by permission. You have stopped gripping, and in that moment, whether you can name it or not, you have surrendered. Not surrendered in defeat, not giving up, but giving over. Handing the situation, more than that, handing your identity back into the hands of something higher than your fear. This is not the surrender that says, I don't care anymore. It is the surrender that says, I care too much to carry it like this any longer. The act of release is one of the most terrifying and liberating moves a soul can make. Because for the ego, release feels like death. It's the end of control, the end of narrative, the end of proving. But for the spirit, release is life returning. It's not passive, it's not resignation. It is the conscious choice to stop letting your small self run the show. You realize you cannot hold both the grip and the grace. One will block the other. The grip says, let me figure this out. The grace says, let it be revealed. The grip says, if I just do enough, maybe it will all come together. The grace says, when I stand in truth, it already is. This is the moment when everything rises. Your fear, your effort, your calculations, your silent dread, all of it swells like a wave in your chest. You want to hold on, maybe just one more day, maybe just until the answer comes. But deep inside, something cracks, not in weakness, but in mercy. You know that if you don't let go, you'll go under. So, you stop, you breathe, you don't say a mantra, you don't perform a technique, you just become still. And in that stillness, the rising wave crests, then it breaks, then it sinks. And what's left in its wake is not numbness, it's not emptiness, it's presence. The kind of presence that doesn't argue, that doesn't promise anything, that just is. You have entered the territory beyond striving, beyond self-improvement, beyond fixing. This is where God meets you, not because you called hard enough, but because you finally stopped shouting long enough to hear. The soul is most alive when it dies to the need to manage. That dying is not poetic. It feels like falling. It feels like nothing. It feels at first like loss. The part of you that always had a plan has no plan left. The part of you that prided itself on surviving has run out of strategies. And in that strange vacancy, you wait. You do nothing. You let go of letting go. And in that waiting, something real begins to emerge. This is not the high of victory. This is the low flame of peace, the kind that burns steady through all weather. You no longer need the problem to disappear. You no longer care if anyone sees how hard it's been. You don't need reward. You need only this holy stillness where nothing performs, nothing proves, nothing demands. In the teachings of Fox, there is a deep undercurrent of this moment. It's not often shouted from stages or put into tidy affirmations, but it's there in the recognition that surrender is not weakness, but power finally free from panic. It's the power that says, I can walk through this, or around this, or beyond this, but I will not carry it like a godless thing anymore. You don't reach this place through intellect. You arrive here when intellect fails you, and something older than words begins to lead. You feel it in your body, like the release that comes not from sleep, but from exhale, not from resolution, but from finally not resisting what is. This is not where your story ends, but it is where your struggle changes shape. Because once you've surrendered from the center, not just in words, but in essence, something in you no longer moves the same way. You don't chase answers. You don't fear silence. You don't race to restore what never really belonged to you. You are no longer the fixer. You are the field in which life flows. You can still act. You can still speak. You may even still cry. But you do it without clinging, without narrating, without making pain your identity. The pain may still pass through, but it doesn't stay, because there's no more altar in your mind where fear gets fed. You've taken it down, and in its place stands something stronger than willpower. It is the steady awareness that says, I don't have to carry what was never mine. I don't have to fear what cannot define me. I don't have to perform peace, I can live it. This is what happens when you surrender. You don't become small. You become real. There's a moment when your eyes open not physically, but inwardly, and you remember who you are. Not the version shaped by survival, not the one hardened by disappointment, but the one beneath all that. The you that never fractured, the you that never bowed to fear, the one who, even while buried under layers of noise and programming, has always remained unshaken. This remembering is not dramatic. It's not even loud. It's more like turning a corner in your own mind and suddenly finding that something solid has always been there. A foundation you didn't build, but one that holds you nonetheless. That foundation is your inner authority. Most people give that authority away without realizing it. They hand it over to circumstance, to outcomes, to other people's opinions. They let a phone call dictate their peace. They let a number in a bank account determine their worth. They let a delay, a symptom, a silence unravel their clarity. That's not weakness, it's habit. But habit doesn't equal truth. And truth doesn't depend on how things look. To reclaim inner authority is to remember that your consciousness is first cause. Not your job, not your diagnosis, not the market, not the news. Your thought-sustained, deliberate, aligned us, the beginning of all change. Not because you force it, but because it is law. You may not have chosen your current circumstance, but you are choosing how to think within it. That choice either deepens your entrapment or initiates your liberation. And here's the part we often avoid. No one can make that choice for you. Not your teacher, not your partner, not your therapist. You can be supported, guided, inspired, but the inner pivot belongs to you alone. Emmet Fox said it clearly. There is no outer problem that can stand long in the face of inner truth. But that truth only becomes power when you claim it. Not once, not with a flourish, but again and again, each time you notice your mind bending to the outer world's command. You bend back. You say inwardly, I am not at the mercy of this appearance. I live from cause, not from effect. This doesn't mean denial. You still show up. You still deal with what's in front of you, but you do it from the throne, not from the dungeon. You're no longer reaching upward, begging for clarity. You're speaking downward from the place that sees, that knows, that doesn't flinch. And this knowing doesn't need evidence. It creates evidence. Slowly, yes. Quietly, often, but steadily. Because truth doesn't chase, it radiates. And when you dwell in it, you do too. But let's be honest. There are days when you forget. Days when fear tightens its grip. When the news is bad. When you're tired. When your body reacts. When your mind returns to its old grooves. On those days, inner authority feels like a dream you once had but lost. That's okay. That's human. But even then, even in the middle of it all, you can still choose. The moment you remember that your state is yours, not something being done to you, the shift begins. You may not feel it fully yet, but the current has already changed. You've broken the trance. And the trance is the real problem. Not the condition, but the belief that the condition has more power than your consciousness. That's the lie that binds. That's the spell that breaks when you stand up inside yourself and say, enough. I know who I am. You are not defined by how long it takes. You are not made weak by how much it hurts. You are not lesser because of the facts. Facts are not laws. Conditions are not gods. And your truth is not fragile. The world may not applaud when you reclaim your authority. It might not even notice, but you will. You'll feel it in the way you breathe, in the way your posture changes, in the silence between thoughts. You'll feel it when you speak to someone and don't need them to agree, when you walk into a room and don't need to prove anything, when you sit with a challenge and don't collapse into it. This is not arrogance. This is alignment. And from alignment comes clarity, not always about what to do, but about how to be while you do it. Clarity doesn't always solve the whole thing, but it brings the next step, and that's all you ever really need. One clean step, one steady breath, one choice not to bow. That's how it begins. That's how the kingdom is reclaimed. Not in grand gestures, but in the simple refusal to let fear speak last. By now, you've begun to feel it not just as an idea, but as a presence in your own life. Thought is not invisible in the way we once imagined. Thought becomes form, not metaphorically, not as a comforting belief, but actually, literally, and with a fidelity that cannot be faked. You've seen it in small ways. The quiet shift in a conversation when your inner state changes. The day that flows differently not because the world got easier, but because you stopped bracing against it. The clarity that rises unprovoked once you let go of the noise. These are not accidents. They are reflections, not rewards, not magic, but mirrors held up to your state of being. You are not pushing on life. You are informing it. You are shaping the field in which life takes form. The golden key is not a spell. It's an instruction to your own consciousness. It says, I no longer animate this fear with my attention. I turn now to the truth, and I hold my gaze. And in that gaze, something shifts. Not always dramatically, but always faithfully. The invisible begins to congeal, not because you forced it, because you aligned with what was always waiting to come through. The world teaches you to react, to hustle, to fix, to explain, to defend. But reaction lives at the surface. Creation lives at the root. You're not waiting for things to improve before you change your mind. You're changing your mind first, because that is what causes things to improve. This is why so many people stay stuck, because they want proof before peace. They want confirmation before commitment. But spiritual law doesn't bend to that demand. It says, decide who you are. Stand there. Then, watch what rises to meet you. And that watching requires strength. Because at first, it may seem like nothing is happening. The storm still rages, the bills still come, the body still aches. But underneath it all, the vibration has shifted. Your state has changed, and state is everything. You can say all the right words, but if your state is fear, those words fall flat. You can act with impeccable logic, but if your state is panic, your actions will echo with that frequency. You can serve, give, build, but if you're secretly trying to outrun an unspoken terror, your world will reflect that desperation. So the focus is not just to do the work, but to be the frequency. You don't affirm abundance while clenching in scarcity. You don't speak love while vibrating in resentment. You don't invoke God while mentally scrolling through disaster scenarios. You align, you return, you focus. And from that focus, form emerges. It may show up as a phone call, an opening, a moment of grace. Or it may show up as a sudden inner knowing. This is not mine to carry. Either way, it is the outer echo of an inner pivot. This is why the golden key is not about results, it's about resonance. You hold the thought of God not to get something, but because it is the only stable ground on which form can reflect truth. Anything else is a loop, a negotiation with appearances, a trap disguised as responsibility. You'll know the shift when you stop checking for progress, when your peace doesn't depend on how the facts are lining up, when you find yourself walking through uncertainty without the usual tightening in your chest. That is not apathy, that is authority. That is what it means to create not from effort, but from essence. Neville Goddard spoke of this as the law of assumption, that you must live in the state of the wish fulfilled, not imagine it, not hope for it, but become it. And the state is not fantasy, it is vibration. It is the feeling tone of the mind when it no longer doubts its own power. So, thought becomes form not by trickery, not by perfection, but by the sustained, steady atmosphere of your inner world. And that atmosphere is your responsibility. Not your job to fix everything in a day, but your job to become the kind of consciousness where truth feels at home. That consciousness is not manicured. It is not performative. It is not curated for others to see. It is yours, private, powerful, silent. And when you live there, even part of the time, the field responds, not because you begged, but because you became. That is the real work, and it cannot be done from the surface. So turn again. Hold your thoughts steady, not for the world to notice, but because you've finally remembered how life actually works. To make the turn permanent is not about intensity. It is about consistency. It's not about clinging to God with white knuckles. It's about returning to that awareness so regularly that it becomes your homonaut, your refuge during storms, but your dwelling regardless of weather. The mistake most make is this. They turn to God when pain peaks, and then, when a sense of ease returns, they loosen their gaze. They drift back into distraction, not from malice, but from habit. And slowly, without realizing it, their consciousness begins to slip just enough for the old thought to re-enter, for the atmosphere to dim, for the problem to reclaim center stage. This isn't failure, it's forgetfulness. And forgetfulness is human. But permanence isn't built through breakthroughs, it's built through rhythm, through the daily, humble act of returning. You don't keep the turn alive through drama. You keep it alive through devotion. You treat your focus the way you'd tend a lamp in the night. Quietly, faithfully, you shield it from the wind. You feed it before it fades. You understand that the strength of the flame lies not in its size, but in its steadiness. There are no shortcuts to this. There are no quick hacks to make God your constant reference point. It is a practice. It is a relationship. And like all relationships, it deepens not through grand gestures, but through presence. You begin to notice the subtle pull, the way your mind wants to revisit the problem, even after clarity has come. You see how quickly your attention shifts when you get tired, or busy, or reactive. And in seeing it, you gently bring yourself back, not with guilt, not with shame, but with reverence for your own awareness. You might begin the day with a clear mind, a centered heart, and by noon find yourself tangled in thought patterns that have nothing to do with truth. This doesn't mean you've undone your work. It simply means you've drifted. And every drift is an invitation to return, not frantically, not anxiously, but steadily. This is the muscle you build, returning without story. No inner drama about how often you forget, no scoreboard. Just the quiet certainty. I know where home is, I go there now. And what's remarkable is that over time, this returning becomes less of a task and more of a reflex. Your thought starts to crave clarity. Your heart starts to reject the weight of false narratives. Your body begins to settle when the atmosphere of truth surrounds it. You find yourself less interested in analyzing the problem and more devoted to holding the energy of the solution. You also begin to recognize when you've slipped, not because life gets worse, but because you feel the difference. You feel when you're living from reaction instead of response. You feel the dullness of thought when it's not plugged into source. And instead of pushing harder, you simply pivot. This is the wisdom of sustaining the turn. You don't push through. You step back into alignment. You don't chase results. You remain available to reality. And as your availability increases, your reliance on force begins to dissolve. Eventually, your mind stops asking, "Is this working?" That question fades, because the work is no longer about outcome. It's about resonance. It's about integrity with your own knowing. It's about choosing the frequency of God not as a means to an end, but as the end itself. And what if circumstances still look chaotic? What if the world doesn't immediately mirror your inner state? Then you hold steady. You remember that the outer is not the scorekeeper of the inner. That delay does not mean disconnection. That the point was never control. The point was clarity. And clarity is never wasted. Even if your world doesn't change today, you did. And that change lives in your field now. It lives in the way you walk into a room, in the way you speak to someone, in the way you breathe through uncertainty. This shift is quiet, but it's seismic. You no longer need the world to confirm your turn, because the turn is no longer a technique. It's your nature. It's who you are now. You return not because you have to, but because you can't not. You've tasted peace. You've glimpsed real authority. And once you've known that center, everything else feels like noise. So sustain the turn, not as effort, but as rhythm. Not with strain, but with attention. Make God the axis, not the option. And the longer you live from that axis, the more your life will begin to take its shape from the inside out. Not by accident, not by luck, but by law. To live from the center is to no longer search for stability in the ever-changing. It is to stop chasing safety and conditions and begin drawing strength from the unmovable ground within. It is a quiet revolution, the moment when you stop looking outside yourself for proof that all is well, and instead become the source of that well-being. This center isn't an emotional state. It's not about feeling good. It's a position of awareness zone that refuses to collapse into panic or scatter into distraction. It's the part of you that watches, listens, and responds without the compulsion to control. And when you begin living from there, your entire relationship to life changes. You no longer move like someone reacting to 100 tiny alarms. You move like someone who has already returned. You listen more than you explain. You speak with fewer words and more weight. Your presence becomes its own statement, not because you're trying to impress, but because you're no longer pulled away from yourself. Living from the center doesn't mean you never get shaken. It means the shaking doesn't uproot you. You feel the tremor. You hear the noise. But you remain clear. You recognize that the storm isn't stronger than the ground you're standing on. That ground is not a belief. It is not even your willpower. It is the consciousness of alignment. The inner knowing that God is not something you visit. God is the space from which you live. You've probably noticed this shift already. The way you respond differently to things that used to unravel you. The way you can witness discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. The way you no longer need constant reassurance because you've started trusting your own vibration more than external validation. This isn't a peak you climb. It's a state you return to again and again until it becomes your rhythm, until presence becomes your default, until spiritual stillness is not what you seek, but what you carry. And yes, you'll still feel anger, sadness, frustration. Living from the center doesn't eliminate emotion, it integrates it. It allows you to feel fully without being consumed. You no longer make the feeling your identity. You don't act from it blindly. You watch it pass through like a wave while your root remains in place. There is incredible freedom in that. You stop micromanaging your inner life. You stop performing spiritual calm. You simply live as one who knows where to return. This is what it means to walk through life radiating steadiness. You don't need to convince people you're okay. They feel the frequency before you speak. They sense that you're not pulling at them for certainty, that you're already seated in something deeper than approval or outcome. And when conflict arises, you meet it differently. Not with passivity, but with clarity. You can say no without defensiveness. You can draw boundaries without emotional charge. Because you're not protecting yourself out of fear, you're expressing truth from center. This is what spiritual strength looks like in real life. It's not just in your affirmations or your silent time. It's in your posture during conflict. It's in your tone during hard conversations. It's in your choices when no one is watching. Living from center also means you stop outsourcing your direction. You may receive guidance, yes. You may seek counsel. But the final tuning fork is inward. You don't move unless it's aligned. You don't rush just because things feel urgent. You trust timing not in a vague way, but because you've come to understand that action without alignment always costs more than it gives. You may notice a new kind of power emerging, quiet, clean, subtle. You don't have to chase anymore. You attract. You don't have to dominate. You resonate. You don't have to convince. You live. And your life becomes the proof. None of this makes you better than anyone. It simply makes you rooted. And rootedness is a gift to yourself and to everyone around you. Because when you live from the center, others remember they can too. There is a kind of spiritual clarity that doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need recognition. It just moves. It walks into a room and alters the atmosphere, not by trying, but by being. That's who you are when you've sustained the turn long enough for it to become your posture. You are no longer a seeker scrambling for signs. You are no longer a thinker debating the truth. You are a carrier of the field and embodiment of what you once hoped to glimpse. You are the still point. You are the calm under the motion. You are the center from which peace radiates into form. Stillness is not absence. It is not numbness or withdrawal or some fragile quiet you have to protect. Stillness drew stillness's presence intensified. It is thought at rest in its rightful place. It is your being undivided. And when you reach it not as a peak, but as a return, you find that the stiller you become, the more life begins to move around you with grace and order. This is the paradox that few ever trust long enough to witness. They think they must press harder, figure more, manipulate the pieces into place. But you're no longer drawn to that noise, not because you've become passive, but because you've come to know what actually moves reality. Not force, not panic disguised as diligence, but resonance, radiant stillness. When you stand in stillness, not frozen, not waiting, but present something in the field around you begins to adjust. People sense it even if they don't understand it. Circumstances begin to soften. The pressure starts to release. The things you once strained for begin to emerge not because you chased them, but because you've become congruent with their arrival. This isn't about impressing life with your focus. It's about dissolving the inner noise that was once repelling your good. The resistance wasn't out there. It never was. It was in the static of your thought, the constant rehearsal of fear, the subtle bracing against disappointment. Stillness untangles that, and in its place rises a new kind of clarity, not rushed, not brittle, but inevitable. You begin to move less, but accomplish more. You speak less, but say more. You plan less, but things fall into place with a rhythm that makes your old efforts seem like noise. This is not spiritual fantasy. It is the lived experience of those who dare to trust alignment more than adrenaline. But here's the part no one tells you. Arriving at this stillness often requires going through a kind of inner death, not a tragedy, a disintegration. A melting down of the self that needed to be seen, that needed to fix, that needed the world to bend just right before it could rest. You may feel lost in the transition. You may not know who you are when you're no longer defined by striving. You may grieve, even in the quiet. But the grief is not for what was real. It's for what was required by your old identity, the tension, the vigilance, the illusion of control. And in that grief, something opens. A kind of space you've never felt before. A breath that comes from somewhere deeper than your lungs. A silence not empty but alive. You begin to feel what can only be described as the hum of source. Not above you, not outside you, but through you. And once you feel that hum, you no longer rush to escape discomfort. You let it be there, knowing it cannot survive your stillness. You no longer fear uncertainty, because uncertainty has no power over someone who is not frantically seeking definition. You don't collapse under chaos, because you're not built on structure, you're built on essence. Manly P. Hall once wrote that the truly illumined man does not attempt to govern life. He aligns with it. He listens for its pattern. He moves when the deeper current says move, and until then he waits not in laziness, but in the active energy of readiness. That is what stillness offers, not escape, but precision. From this place, decisions are cleaner. Energy is conserved. The nervous system, once wound tight like a fist, begins to release. You trust the moment not because it's easy, but because you know how to be in it without being consumed. This is mastery not over others, not even over circumstance, but over your own awareness. You are no longer yanked around by headlines, moods, or old scripts. You are aware of them, but not animated by them. You can feel everything without becoming lost in anything. That is what stillness births. And the world, as it always does, begins to respond. Not immediately, not always dramatically, but with fidelity. Your stillness becomes gravity. Your peace becomes instruction. Your calm becomes invitation. Not because you're trying to project anything, but because life mirrors coherence. Life reflects the quality of being, and radiant stillness is the highest quality you can carry. So let the outside swirl if it must. Let timelines stretch. Let others misread your quiet. You are not here to rush a process that is already unfolding. You are here to live inside the moment so completely that it opens itself to you, one breath at a time. Let it open. Let yourself stay. Let stillness do what effort never could. There is no technique now. No more turning, no more affirming, no more subtle reaching for the next moment. You are here. Not performing presence, not chasing clarity, but resting fully in the simplicity of being. And here, at last, The golden key reveals its final form not as a method, but as a way of seeing, a way of being. You may have thought this was about solving something, about fixing a condition, or unlocking a door, or finding relief from the ache you couldn't name. But if you followed this journey with your whole self, then you know by now it was never about the problem. It was about your alignment with truth. And now that you've realigned, the problem has no place left to live. That doesn't mean all appearances have changed, but it means they can no longer control you, because you've stepped beyond the territory of fear and into the unchanging field of God. And in that field, nothing is missing, nothing is broken, nothing is late. This is what it means to hold the key not in your hand, but in your consciousness. The key is not what opens the door, you are. You no longer pray with pleading, you abide with power. You no longer argue with fear, you see through it and it dissolves. You no longer define yourself by progress, you define yourself by presence. And in that presence, you become a silent force calm, unwavering, unmistakable. You don't need the next thing to work out. You don't need circumstances to bend in your favor. You are no longer in conversation with the world's chaos. You are in conversation with reality, the kind that doesn't shift with the weather, the kind that doesn't react to appearances, the kind that was true before the story began and will be true after the details fade. The golden key is not just about thought, it is about allegiance, to where you stand inside yourself. And from that stance, thought takes its shape. Action becomes effortless. Decisions unfold in rhythm. Even speech carries weight, not because it is clever, but because it's anchored in clarity. This is the end of efforting. You no longer try to believe. You live from belief made real not as concept, but as atmosphere. The question is no longer, what do I do? The question is obsolete, because you are already doing in stillness, in thought, in alignment. When others ask how you remain calm, you won't explain. You'll just continue. When life demands your attention, you'll respond, not react. And when fear tries to return, you'll feel the shift immediately. Not as panic, but as a moment to realign. You've learned to recognize the signs. And more importantly, you've learned how to return. Not because of instruction, but because of integration. So let this be said clearly without the need for repetition or flourish. The golden key is not something you use, it is something you become. A person whose thought is no longer hostage to fear, whose attention is no longer scattered, whose identity is no longer shaped by external terms. You don't need to keep proving your spiritual depth. You're not here to be impressive, you're here to be free. And freedom, as it turns out, isn't loud. It doesn't chase validation. It doesn't broadcast clarity. It just lives, breathes, moves quietly through a world still trying to figure things out. Freedom knows the truth. Freedom thinks the truth. Freedom is the truth, expressed. You've crossed the threshold now, not to a place, but to a way of life. You've become a keeper of your thought, a steward of your state, a presence that no longer collapses under noise. This is not an ending. It is the beginning of a new kind of seeing, and the seeing will shape everything. Now, let everything settle. There is nothing more to chase, nothing more to understand, no next principle to grasp, no clever phrase to remember. You've walked this path step by step, not by being told what to believe, but by being reminded of what you've always known. Somewhere deep in you, this truth was never foreign. It was only waiting for your full return. Let your breath ease. Let your mind unclench. You're not trying to hold on to this, you're allowing it to stay. This isn't a high to preserve, it's a rhythm to live. Some days will feel radiant. Others will feel dull. That doesn't matter. The truth is not in how you feel. The truth is in the ground you now recognize beneath every mood, beneath every thought, beneath every challenge. You are no longer looking for God like a distant echo. You are no longer whispering prayers from a place of smallness. You are aware now that the presence you sought has always been the core of your being. The golden key wasn't about fixing your life. It was about waking up to the fact that you were never truly lost. So rest if you can. Let stillness have the final word. You are already held. You are already home. Let tomorrow come as it will. Let circumstances unfold as they must. You are no longer waiting for life to bring you peace. You are the one bringing peace to life. The work is not over, but the wandering is. The silence now is not emptiness. It is the sound of alignment. It is the sound of you, whole. It is the sound of truth, steady and quiet, in the background of everything.